感谢大家来参加愚园社本期的围炉对话活动。Thank you for joining us for this meaningful and timely conversation about tech competition and the cooperation between California and China with special guests and experts on this topic, Matt Sheehan and moderator Eva Woo. As we wait for people to join in, I'd like to introduce our community to any new viewers. I'm Michelle Zhang, the founder of the Society of Heart's Delights. Yuyuanshe in Chinese. We established our community platform right before the pandemic hit last year and moved our events from our historic building in San Jose to online gatherings. We are a growing community of Chinese immigrants who moved to America as adults and work in diverse fields. Our focus is on creating unique opportunities for Chinese professionals to engage with local life and culture, contribute to the public good using our own voices, and feel a sense of belonging while having fun. If you want to know more about us, please visit our website, thesocietyofheartsdelights.com. You can also find us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn under the name The Society of Heart's Delights, and on WeChat for Mandarin speakers as Yuyuanshe. We'll have more exciting events coming up, and we hope you'll follow along and join us again. Without further ado, I would like to hand the floor over to my friend, who is also an experienced journalist, Eva Woo, for what promises to be a stimulating conversation with our guest, Matt Sheehan.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Michelle, for providing this stage, right? And thank you for everyone for joining us at the official start of the weekend. We all have a glass of wine and we hope you're relaxing. Let's not make it too serious a talk. And we want to be interactive as well. So today we're honored to have one of the smartest, the most promising China analyst, author, Matt Sheehan, former journalist. He actually speaks Chinese as well, to join us to talk about some of the things that are on our mind, tech innovation, China, US, AI, whether to go back to China, maybe, as a Chinese American immigrant. But I think first I want to just introduce Matt. He is a fellow at the Paulson Institute, Hank Paulson's think tank. And Macro Polo is their product. It's where he leads work on US-China technology issues and focusing on AI. His research maps and quantifies the key inputs to AI ecosystem globally. And he also is the author of the book, The Trans-Pacific Experiment, How China and California Collaborate and Compete for Our Future. And Matt also worked closely with Kai-Fu Lee on his famous book, AI Superpower, China, Silicon Valley, and the New World Order. So from 2010 and 2016, Matt had lived and worked in China. He was a correspondent. Actually, accidentally, I just found out that he and I shared the same former boss, Peter Goodman, who was a great journalist with New York Times now. And he was with Huffington Post, the World Post. And when he returned to Bay Area 2016, I think that was at the peak of China FDI pouring into Silicon Valley, if you remember at that time. and he, because of his connection in China, his insights into the culture, people, he was able to connect on a human level with a lot of the people here and see things from both ways, which is a very rare ability, I think, for a China analyst. So he was selected as the finalist for the Young China Watcher of the Year award. And Eva Woo, I am your co-host today. I am a former journalist, and I currently am an impact advisor to tech and social startups in China and US. I am advising global foundations and philanthropists on impact strategies related to China. I live in Silicon Valley. And I manage a China program at Stanford University Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. So I very, very much care about impact and the civil society exchange. Before that, I had spent a decade as a journalist myself. I was with Bloomberg, South China Morning Post, Washington Post, Caijing, Caixin. And I also worked with Cisco on the China leadership program. So, so that's enough about us, but I think we have a lot of grounds to cover, and I want to be very aware of the time because Matt has wrote about a lot of things, and but I want to leave 20 minutes for at least 20 minutes for the audience to raise questions, and I want to. The first thing come to my mind when I heard about this talk we're gonna have is, okay, so what has changed in January 20? Because we all know the things that we have gone through last year, but things seems to be changing a little bit. And on January 20th, we have a new president, and what's the latest update? And about the tensions and the kind of the sense of rivalry, has it been, how does it feel now? Is it looking better? And, but before we get into all that Matt's work, I want to give him 5 minutes to talk about his 缘分 with China. How did he get into the China space? And how, what made you write the book? And yeah, and then we can get into the questions.
Sure. Thanks so much, Eva, for that introduction, and thanks especially to Yuyuanshe, to the Society of the Heart's Delight. Really happy to be here. I've known Michelle and Pat for a while, and I've been to the location where the society is founded and where, when everything's back to normal, they'll be holding events, and it's beautiful. They have a beautiful, wonderful network and a great mission. So I hope that everyone who's on this will have a chance eventually to go to their actual historic building, and we can all, drink wine and have a good time there next year, maybe. So thank you to them. Just in terms of language stuff, Eva and I talked about this before. 我和 Eva 做这个对话的时候，我们会用英文，那样我就可以说的比较准，比较 exact。但是我们到那个问答的时候，或者你要提问的问题，都可以用中文，就是双语都行。所以yeah, anyway, just back to how did I get involved in China? A lot of stumbling into things that ended up being really wonderful, kind of life-changing experiences. So really up until 2008, I was halfway through college in 2008. And up till then, I knew basically nothing about China. I knew, Mao Zedong, Factory of the World, that's pretty much it. We really don't learn a lot in American schools, at least when I was growing up. 2008, I just sort of by chance got this opportunity to be a camp counselor at a summer camp in Beijing. So I basically had a summer job right in the hutongs by Hohai in Beijing. And yeah, again, I landed with basically no knowledge, but almost immediately, my first few days, my first week there, I thought, this is so interesting, so fascinating. And when I graduate, I have to come back and live here. And I think for me, the reason that was because I'd grown up mostly in Palo Alto. I lived in Illinois when I was little, but I grew up mostly in Palo Alto, went to Stanford after that. And I think, just spending that much time in a place, especially such a comfortable, beautiful place as, the Bay Area, I think it set my mind into kind of certain patterns of thinking. Oh, it's just really taking in all that sort of California ideology and the California way of approaching problems and creativity and freedom and whatever, whatever you want to call California thinking. And when I went to Beijing, it really quickly kind of turned a lot of it on its head, or at least every problem or everything that I was thinking about was kind of twisted from another angle. At Stanford, I was studying political science, and I had this very kind of organized view of like, this is how the world should operate, and this is how governments work, and this is how society works. And I took economics. Okay, this is how the market works, and it was all just so neat and clean. And when I went to Beijing, I just felt like every day I would step outside and there would just be, you'd see something that would turn all that on its head. You realize that you don't feel the same way about markets and government when you're in a country where your parents were in total poverty and now you live a comfortable life.
And
that
it's
changes.
also a hybrid. It's a place of contradictories. Yeah, go ahead.
Full of contradictions. And I'd say I moved back to China in 2010. First, I lived in Xi'an and I taught English, went to Beijing to study, and eventually got a job as a reporter. But yeah, I'd say the thing that I really loved about it and what got me into China was the fact that any problem I thought about, like a philosophical question, a question about how families should relate to each other, anything that I wanted, China was just offering me new ways of thinking about it. So that's what kind of got me into China. I had a really amazing 5+ years there. And eventually to write the book, there was a lot of Yuyuanshe, kind of fate involved in that as well, where I'd been coming back to the Bay Area, and eventually I met the woman who's now my fiance in the other room there. And so I knew she was living in California, I was living in Beijing, and I knew I had to find a way to get back to California. And so I started getting very interested in China-California connections. And through a series of kind of crazy accidents, I won't go through the whole story, but I involved breaking an ankle, not being able to get a visa to China, a lot of things. I ended up spending about 6 months when I was a reporter, a China journalist who was based in Palo Alto. I was just living in the Bay Area, but I was supposed to be covering China. So I started looking into all these phenomena and realizing there was more and more connections between my two sort of homes than I ever thought before. This is 2013. So this is right as a lot of Chinese home buyers are coming into places like Palo Alto, my hometown, buying a lot of houses. Chinese investors are coming into Silicon Valley and all of California. Almost everything I looked at, students, investment, technology, film, real estate, there's just this huge increase in Chinese presence. And I felt like it wasn't really getting the attention it deserved. It was like, if you're a China expert, you're either in Beijing or you're in Washington, D.C. But I felt like the most interesting stuff was actually happening in California, the Bay Area. So that's kind of how I set out to write the book. And
that was a really smart angle, like choosing Silicon Valley as we were just talking about. This is where, money and people marrying each other, like the cross-border activities. It's really people who see the mutual benefits of working together. And it's very unique path that you charted for yourself, and also a very unique angle for putting all these pieces together to see China and US in new light. So really appreciate, as a former journalist, I think a really smart angle. So that was all interesting, but let's get back to now. We're now in 2021. Let's have a reality check. Like, we have a really tough 2020, right? The COVID, and I know as a matter of fact, a lot of Chinese Americans, like I know, are thinking about maybe, going back to China, like for a few years or even like longer term. This rise and fall, like this dynamics has been changing, but nothing has been so dramatic last year, because COVID, we're really in the dark, and China, actually people are going back to normal life. So what has changed in January 20 and what hasn't? And can you give us some latest update, and either in your field, in terms of innovation, AI maybe later, but also like more general picture?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways to go at that. Maybe I'll start with just kind of like a really zoomed out big picture view of how California, China, US, China have kind of existed over, say, a 10-year time span. where, back at the beginning, 2013, like I mentioned, when I was first getting involved, you saw everything was kind of going up exponentially, the investment, the students, the interactions. And that happened for basically the years like 2010 to 2016, 17-ish. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There was, after the financial crisis, a lot of US cities were looking for real estate investment. A lot of American universities were looking to bring in foreign students. And yeah, there was an open environment where Washington, D.C. just like was not very involved. Washington, D.C. didn't seem to pay attention to Chinese investment, didn't really think through various things with technology and US, China. And I'd say that all those trends kind of built to their high points around 2017, 2018. I'd say that's the period in time when you basically have this, the beginning of this backlash. And I think of it a lot of ways as kind of, it's like Washington, D.C. and the American government kind of reasserting control or reasserting the right to influence a lot of grassroots level trends that were previously kind of left on their own. Chinese student visas were just kind of the number of Chinese students who came to the US was very much a matter of universities just giving them visas. There was not a lot of investment screening, and there was not a lot of interference in the technology space. So Chinese labs could set up in Silicon Valley labs could set up in China, and no one was too worried about it. So it's kind of like a laissez-faire environment.
I felt like it was like a romance relationship suddenly goes sour because they're too close to each other and they're so different.
Exactly.
And this cultural clash and ideology clash when you are too close in the room.
Yeah.
I think you address that in your book somewhat. Yeah.
Yeah. So in a lot of ways, the book kind of charts this like rise and optimism and all that, and then watches as it kind of, falls off or cools down. And I think you put your finger on one, very clear reason, which is, kind of like the closer you get, the more some of these tensions come to the fore. I think a lot of us in this space, or a lot of people who are optimistic about, say, Chinese investment or, cultural interactions, thought, the more you get people sort of talking to each other face to face, the better everything will be. But it can also go in the total opposite direction. So I think sort of the closeness and the proximity of the interactions is one thing. Another thing is the way that the US sees China at a macro level as a competitor. 2010, you asked US government people, Americans, is China, what do you think of Chinese technology? Oh, it's a copycat. Oh, they'll never learn to innovate. Oh, whatever. And when you see someone that way, there might be some interaction where they benefit from taking technology or something like that, but you don't think it's a major threat. And it's basically over the 2010 to 2017 period of time is when basically estimations of where China stood economically, politically, and technologically just dramatically changed. The pendulum swung from thinking China's just a copycat, they'll never compare to the US, to thinking, China's a dominant, superpower, and they're gonna, beat us in AI and beat us in everything else. So the pendulum really swung very far in that direction. It kind of led to almost like a little bit of a freak out in Washington, D.C., where suddenly, it's like they suddenly woke up to just how dense these connections were between, say, Chinese and American people, institutions, companies. And the first instinct then was just like, cut the connections. The first instinct was, we were very connected and China was catching up fast. We need to cut the connections. And so I think a lot of the period 2018 to 2020 was in this kind of frantic pace of decoupling. Maybe we need to block Chinese students. Maybe we need to block Chinese investment, block these tech connections. And I think just to bring it up to what you were talking about, where do we stand now, 2021? I think clearly things are in a pretty negative place. I think they're in a much worse place than they were 5 years ago, 7 years ago, in terms of just the ability to kind of communicate and interact. But I also think the pendulum might be kind of coming back a little bit to the middle. So previously, China is, a little country and it will never catch up with the US, to China's going to eat our lunch and we have to cut all the connections, to I think, especially in the new Biden administration, kind of the point of our talk in some ways, we finally have the ability to think strategically in the US about where do we want to cut connections, where does it actually benefit the US to maintain these connections. So like in my field I study primarily artificial intelligence policy and connections between the countries. 2 years ago, it was China's going to dominate us in everything because they have all the data and they're going to win, and we just need to cut everything off, to now there's an appreciation. Okay, actually the US benefits a lot from having Chinese students come here, do research here, and stay here. So that's one connection we don't want to cut. Okay, but maybe on the sort of intellectual property front, we don't want US semiconductor companies, computer chips, to make all these partnerships with China. So that's one we do want to cut. And so I think
Targeted, kind of more targeted.
Exactly, targeted decoupling. And so I think sort of my hope is that after these two swings, we were unrealistically thought that China would never compete, to we thought that China was going to dominate everything, and we need to cut ties. So I hope we're kind of reaching a little bit of a middle ground where the US is going to be more, it's going to be more conflict than before. But
let's talk about the catch-up game. So it seems that the US government freaked out because the catch-up happens much faster than they thought, right? Much faster. I think partially the mass media and the US public is also responsible. We talked about this information imbalance. The Chinese are constantly learning what's happening in the US. And every Chinese you meet speaks English and can learn in English, but how many people you met in the US are eager to learn Chinese, right? So this information imbalance makes them blind to what's actually been happening in China for quite a while, right? So the innovation capacity is there, like applied innovation that has been very, very developed, right? People are like lean kind of innovate to the market demand. So let's talk about the catch up in the academic, more like kind of advanced technology frontier. The HAI, Center for HAI just had something out, the 2020 index of AI index, which it says the citation, journal citation, which used to be like kind of a sign of AI development, right? China has passed the US, right, last year. I don't know if how important a sign that is, but it seems that the gap is getting narrower. What's your view of kind of this capacity of in terms of the innovation ecosystem? When you look at both countries, what's your take?
Yeah. So I think, when we're trying to describe this in like a simple sort of one sentence version, comparing the ecosystem, one way that we often use is, China's very good at applied technology, at taking the breakthroughs from elsewhere and turning them into products. And the US is really good at sort of groundbreaking innovation. That, if you've got to only remember sort of one sentence, that's an okay summary of it. But I think it is also shifting substantially. China is not just taking what comes out of American sort of AI labs and applying to their products. They have caught up and now surpassed the US in some areas of artificial intelligence. I'll just talk about AI because that's sort of my specialty. So, AI as a term is a big umbrella term that covers a lot of different technologies. There's computer vision, there is natural language processing, kind of having a computer understand what's in text. There's robotics, automation, all these different things. So I think over the last few years, we've seen a lot of catch up in sort of big picture, but the important thing for the next sort of phase of US-China relations is that I think drilling down into very specific subcategories, such that, like, if we look at computer vision, I think it's pretty safe to say China is more advanced than the United States in computer vision. They have more research publications, they have more widely deployed computer vision, largely in the form of surveillance throughout the country. But that's one area where we could say China is ahead. The US, most people tend to say the US is ahead in natural language processing, which is sort of the understanding of text. And I think the one thing I still sort of consistently hear from when I talk to Chinese technologists, Chinese researchers, they will still say that when they look for really original sort of breakthrough advances that kind of change the sort of terrain in AI, they call it 叫什么突破性 the advances. They're still looking to the United States. And I think a lot of that has to do with the incentive structures in the two countries. So in China, companies, both startups and listed companies, and then even academia, there's a lot of pressure on them to make money. Basically, if you're a startup in China, you have to start showing revenue and you have to start showing a profit very quickly. And in the United States, we have a ecosystem, venture capitalists, investors who are willing to say, okay, here's some seed money, here's some Series A money. They might not be expecting a turnaround for 7 or 8 years, or even longer. And that lets you invest in kind of really wide open ideas. So an example everyone uses is Google investing in autonomous vehicles circa 2009, maybe 2008. That's something it would be very hard to imagine a Chinese company back in 2010 or 11 investing in something that might not be a product for a full decade. And so yeah, it's both the companies and the investors tend to have a little bit more of a short-term thinking. And you understand why. It comes out of sort of the economic and cultural conditions. If you invest in China and you invest in real estate, you get return 10% every year for the last 30 years. So you're conditioned to want that kind of return quickly. So I think that's one sort of maybe cultural economic difference. Mm-hmm. And then also with universities, in America, this is really our greatest strength in the United States is the higher education. And we have really internalized the idea that you just need to pay smart people a lot of money to research things that may never turn practical, may never earn money, and may never be useful in terms of technology, but we just, we recognize that we have to keep this ecosystem alive. And China is definitely moving that direction and making that kind of catch up important. But it takes generations. If you were a computer science professor who's like 45 years old right now in Beijing, like your advisor, your professor probably lived through the Cultural Revolution. He might have lost his university post for a decade and gone to work in a coal mine or something. So you can't just pivot a whole university research ecosystem on a dime and suddenly have top talent. It's going to take 5 years, 10 years to build generations of students, but China's definitely making progress.
But on another note, the opaque nature of how university R&D system works, it makes it really hard to analyze too. Like, I think China is trying to do more investment in the kind of the national level labs and universities. So they're playing the catch up in there too. But it is, like you said, longer term in terms of having longer term vision and the whole more healthy ecosystem, probably place is still here, right? Yeah. So this brings us to my next question is, if you wrote about this in your book, about Chinese students, the researchers, the people come here to pursue American dream and get their education. So if you were a tech guy in one of the core technology, let's say AI, right, or biotech, you're a university researcher, you might be a startup entrepreneur wanting to start your own tech startup, would you consider moving back or stay here in the U.S.? What would affect that decision?
Right.
What's your thinking process?
So I'm Matt Sheehan, the American. Is that
you're in the shoes of?
I'm in the shoes of a Chinese.
You're one of the Chinese American, let's say.
Got it.
Educated here, but do you have the option like venture capitalists throwing money, university lab chasing you? What would you do? And meanwhile, you're here, you're worrying about your kids being treated unfairly at school, maybe, given kind of anti-Asian sentiment here.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different dimensions of push and pull there. This was a big topic in my book, and it's just something I've tracked over time. So in the chapter of my book on technology, or the 2 chapters of my book on technology, I followed this guy named Li Zhifei, who's kind of a very good example of what you're talking about. He was born in Wuhan, or somewhere in Hubei in 1978, basically got his undergraduate education in China, worked a little bit there. But this is back in, I think, 2004, when he wanted to go for a PhD in computer science. The place to do that back in 2004 was very clearly the United States, so much more advanced. So he did a PhD in machine learning, computer science. And when he graduated in 2010, he went to work at Google. Because again, 2010, you want to work on machine learning, you want to work at a sort of a top flight global technology company, Google's the place to be. But to your question, when he wanted to found his own startup in 2012, he decided to relocate back to China to do that. And that was, there was a shift in the nature of the Chinese ecosystem. The China in 2012 was much different than the one he had left in 2004. And he sort of timed it very well. This was just as you were getting the big upswing in the Chinese tech ecosystem in terms of investment, in terms of excitement about AI, and just, I think, on a lot of kind of personal dimensions and business dimensions, it just made a lot of sense for him at that time. If you are people are just always more familiar with their home cultural context. You get if you're in an investment meeting and someone makes a reference to an old TV show that they watched growing up, you know what that TV show is. There's many ways that it's kind of just easier in that dimension. Li Zhifei speaks great English, is kind of fully bicultural in that way. But the feeling was, that China presented a greater opportunity to him at that time. If I kind of look up to the present day, I think a lot of it depends on really what you want to push into. And it kind of goes back a little bit to that applied research versus sort of deep long-term research part of it. If you want to found a consumer internet company, an app, China is frankly like a more dynamic space for that right now. In the US, you have very strong incumbents, companies that are not going to be dislodged and that kind of just vacuum up whatever the newest thing is. Whereas in China, in the last few years, you have seen something like ByteDance, TikTok, Douyin come about that was able to really edge in and dislodge a lot of the incumbents. And, I think if you're a very ambitious person who's trying to make a lot of money and trying to sell a lot of products, and you're Chinese born, there's a lot of reasons to go home other than just being close to your mom and dad, eating the food that you like growing up, all that kind of normal stuff. I do think there are still really compelling reasons to be in Silicon Valley, especially if you want to truly work at the sort of global frontier when it comes to deep tech research. Maybe that's not really what most startups are doing, but a startup like OpenAI, is a leading AI research lab. It's important for them to be here. And I think that's the main pull. This is not even bringing in all these sort of ethical, political dimensions. Do you like having total access to the global internet? Then you mostly got to be in the US. Do you want to be a part of a system that involves surveillance and stuff like that? These are all questions that people have to kind of decide on their own.
It makes it a lot more complicated, adding those dimensions even more complicated. Obviously, from a personal life perspective, it's also complicated if you're Chinese living here. So that's why we're discussing here, because a lot of us, Chinese American, I'm talking about the Yuyuanshe members and a lot of immigrants here, Chinese immigrants here, are having this question, asking ourselves these questions these days. But it is an interesting data point. If you look at, we talked about this, Huren has this latest report about high net worth rich Chinese people rather stay in China. Like this year, 71% of them are not considering immigrant into US, immigrant into US. And when in 2018 it was 38%. So it was a big jump for people who rather stay in China.
Just pausing on that for a second. I've followed that survey for a while, and for people who don't know it offhand, Hurun is this company that tracks the super rich, basically millionaires and billionaires and whatnot. And they've run this survey asking high net worth, very rich Chinese people, basically, are you planning to immigrate? Are you thinking about immigrating? Are you planning on staying, et cetera, et cetera? And when I first got to China in 2010, 11, I mean, the number of rich people who were planning on leaving the country was shocking. It was something, if I'm remembering it correct, like 75% of high net worth individuals were saying, yes, I'm planning to leave China. And that was kind of a sign of the times, like the corruption, the pollution, the feeling that the economy might kind of fall apart, maybe a property bubble. and the feeling that maybe specifically in the technology space, that maybe this isn't really the place to be at the forefront of the action. And I think one of the biggest changes over the last decade, 2010 to 2020, is just the different perceptions that a lot of wealthy, sometimes international, sometimes educated abroad Chinese people feel about the prospect of living and growing up in China. The last decade, for many reasons, the US has come out not looking like the greatest, safest place that it once was. And a lot of people look at China and say, yeah, I feel comfortable with my kids going to school here. I feel comfortable that they can live a certain life here. And, there's so many messy things that go into that. It's personal, it's political, it's all these things. But I do think that, especially we in the United States, Americans need to appreciate how much that change kind of impacts our ability to attract and retain people. And in China, it's a big victory for Xi Jinping and the government to be able to hold on to your most talented, wealthy people.
Yeah, exactly. And as our one of our audience member commented, I think you're right, very insightful about this long-term like lab kind of deep research versus applied, and probably here a lot of the entrepreneurs or big tech companies, engineers at the big tech companies still feel like the frontier is here, but we don't know how long that will last. I hope. The other thing is from another question sort of related to that is that if we are staying here, we meaning Chinese Americans, immigrants, from a risk management perspective, how do people who have these bicultural experiences, because before a lot of people are straddling both worlds and are trying to get benefit from being on both worlds, but for the past couple of years, more and more, people are thinking about choosing a side, right? Mm-hmm. It's kind of like things you read in news headlines, like scientists getting into trouble, like working with Chinese labs, or so from a risk management perspective, how do Chinese Americans manage personal risk and maybe organizational risk if you have a startup that has, people who are from Chinese natives, but like living here in the deep tech kind of field? How do we collab? Like, how do you deal with the Chinese parties, like universities, companies, individuals? Is there an optimal path to get the best of both worlds, or is it not possible?
I feel like risk management, it sounds like something you know more about than me with your background in impact and all that. I'll try to give some kind of a reply. I do think that, yeah, there's a lot of pressure. People feel a lot of pressure now to pick sides. Yeah, it's an unfortunate reality that people who have deep connections, family connections, personal connections, who love both countries, love both cultures, feel that has gone from maybe a strength to something that they could be attacked for. And I think that's just a really sort of sad statement on where we are. From the risk management question, I think the biggest thing that has changed in the US on this front, I can't speak to exactly how it's changed in China recently, but in the US on this front, I think it's basically needing to really think through and look several layers deep into what is ultimately behind a connection or a source of money inside of China. And also just recognize that, if you're someone who's very familiar with both systems, you might know that, oh yeah, that is a state-owned company, but it's really mostly private. Or like, yeah, they are a Communist Party official, but we all know that, like, if you're familiar with both systems, you can tell something of the difference between a sort of a spy agency or just a regular company or official who happens to have some kind of tie to the state. Because in Chinese society, most things have some kind of tie to the state. And so what I think it's important from a risk perspective is basically you need to be able to look 1, 2, maybe 3 layers deep to see if there's anything on that side that ends up being what could set off an alarm bell for someone in Washington, D.C. in law enforcement, or someone who's just concerned about ethical implications of something. So maybe, 5-10 years ago, if you're a computer vision researcher in the United States, and some Chinese company says, hey, we really like your research, we want to sponsor your lab, we want to give you $1 million to found a lab. And, you just have to kind of keep in touch with us and whatever, normal sort of academic sponsorship. 5-10 years ago, you could have said, yeah, this is great. Science is free. Innovation is open. We're an open ecosystem. So yeah, nowadays, you'd have to know, does that computer vision company in China, do they participate in the surveillance apparatus? Do they have anything to do with Uyghurs and Xinjiang? Is that professor that you're talking to, who you think maybe is just a professor, are they also appointed at like a Chinese military university or something like that? So, I think the last few years, there's been this kind of rush to judgment in a lot of cases where, American institutions or people who are maybe not familiar with all the nuances in China, they'll say, they'll draw kind of a direct link and say, if you have any tie to China or if you have any tie to an institution, immediately this is kind of all just part of Chinese government plan to take and steal everything. I hope and I think that we're starting to move past that very sort of overreaction type stage of things, but it just becomes more and more important on the people involved to really look into the things you might not want to look into and kind of ask uncomfortable questions that, if it's your part, you're a professor, they're a professor, you don't really want to put them in an awkward position, but you might have to ask some uncomfortable questions about who will have access to this research, and just think, even on your own side, is something that I'm creating opening up new possibilities for unethical things that I don't want to be a part of.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I for a fact, I know that Xinjiang, a lot of Chinese Americans are not like fully aware of how serious this is actually to the mainstream American press or like government decision makers. So there's some really interesting questions coming from the audience members. I think we want to leave enough time for that. So I'll start from this question from Kevin Zhang. Do you think US is gradually becoming China in a bad way, such as big media and tech giants, information censorship? Do you think this is the long-term trend or not?
I think maybe the different, so, you can see where the question is coming from, in the sense that China is a very limited information environment, censored by and large by the government, which, the company is doing it on behalf of the government. And definitely in the United States, yeah, it's become a more charged environment where where media is more, how to put it? Yeah, there are some topics that have become kind of taboo to talk about in the United States. I think the big differentiator that I would put in is that in America, it's a matter of polarization, and there's still two poles. There is a information ecosystem, particularly in the media realm, that is just, fully over here, and you can say whatever you want in that one, and there's an information ecosystem over here. But obviously we're talking about conservative, liberal, left, right. Fox News or whatever, MSNBC or New York Times. So, I don't like this. I don't like this polarization, and I don't like the way that each side comes to think that, it's taboo, or you could be canceled or kicked out of the conservative movement or whatever it is for holding a wrong thought. But I do think it is kind of a fundamental difference between the US and China on this front. In China, there's only one pole, and that pole is the government's narrative about things. There are many creative people who work around that and still get good information out and do really good work, but it's not a matter of opposing poles that are kind of fighting each other over this distance. So I think, yeah, I guess I would put that down as the main differentiator. Definitely doesn't mean I like the US information environment. Definitely doesn't mean I like the Chinese information environment, but I do think that remains a pretty fundamental difference.
Yeah, that is whole new topic, talking about disinformation, the election, even the disinformation in the Chinese media outlets among the Chinese immigrants. That's a very complex issue, but I think I know what this person is asking.
Yeah.
But I agree with you. It's a different kind of, it looks like a same kind of censorship, self-censorship, but it's different. Essentially, it's different. We can get into that another time, but we want to get into some other interesting questions. What will be the best way to stop the increasing trend of hate crimes against Asians? And I have a actually related question I was going to ask you. As Chinese Americans, immigrants in California, how can we do to better bridge the knowledge gap? And I think a lot of the hate crimes coming from this knowledge imbalance of information flow, knowledge gap, kind of partially. How can we help? How can we protect ourselves or make our views more visible?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a very important question. It's a very scary time in this sense with a rise in hate crimes over the last few weeks or months. I honestly don't know if I have any really helpful thoughts on it. I think I share the feeling that this is terrible, that this is in a lot of ways connected to the kind of larger US-China environment and the larger rhetoric that's come out of it. I think the way that former President Trump talked about China, talked about Chinese people in the US, I think that was a huge kind of opened the door to some of this in a way. Maybe that's a controversial take, but I do think, I think the power of the megaphone that you have when you're president matters a lot. And I don't think it's a total coincidence. When it comes to, specifically combating this trend, I don't know if I have many great ideas. I do think it's very encouraging that the Chinese Americans, Asian Americans that I know have become much more vocal about this and have kind of specifically forced the media to cover it in a way. In the early weeks of this, I think there was a lot of, it just didn't get reported in mainstream media in the same way that it would if it were another US ethnic group. And Chinese Americans, Asian Americans that I know who work in the media, they put a lot of pressure on the media. They said, you have to cover this. This is a really important issue. And I think that that worked. Basically, it's probably still not getting enough attention or as much as it should, but I do think that a group coming together and just kind of, really putting the spotlight on it and telling members of the media that you have to think about this, I do think it had an impact.
I think Chinese immigrants here, we ourselves, a lot of us have been focusing more on our professional life, like less about the community, participating in community, making ourselves heard or volunteer and all that, and participating in civil society. I think all that could contribute to this. And another question from is my friend Sizi Cheng from Boston. How reversible do you think the American public's negative perception about China is? I'm not talking about sentiment directed toward specific topics such as China is stealing American tech IP, but those toward a general sense that China and the US represent two fundamentally different political systems. And the difference between them is just impossible to reconcile. I have the same question often. No matter how much mutual understanding. I mean, more and more we feel like it's not a knowledge gap issue. It's really the different values and different ideologies.
I think that, unfortunately, I kind of got to be a little negative on this front and say that I don't think that the shift that has happened is really reversible at this point. I think we might be at like kind of the worst part of the shift. The same thing talking about the pendulum sort of swinging back and forth with everything that's happened between the US and China the last few years. And then you threw on COVID on top of that. It's kind of, it's really peak sense of that sentiment, even if, many of those parts of that perception are unfair or they're not nuanced, something like that. I do think we're kind of at a peak of that. But I don't think that American perceptions are going back to maybe the way they thought about China in 2008, which is wow, this is a very impressive country, rising, yeah, growing in importance, we should learn about it. But fundamentally, you might associate China more with, I don't know, calligraphy or the Beijing Olympics opening ceremony. That's probably your main image of China, as opposed to the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping. I think over the last decade, both because of changes in the US, but also just fundamental changes in China, President Xi Jinping and the Communist Party have really moved to front and center in that relationship, and they have changed the direction of the system in certain ways that I don't see that changing anytime soon, because there are, politically speaking, there are just fundamental differences, and I don't think the US is going back on that perception.
How much do you think we as civil society members, nonprofits, that kind of exchange on the civil society, because often we equal the Chinese government to Chinese people, like in the US, right? Government and the narratives has been like Xinjiang, but we Chinese people are different. The men and the women on the streets, we have our dreams, we're aspirations, and we don't completely agree with the government's agenda. We, meaning the Chinese, not necessarily we Chinese immigrants. But I think what can the civil society do is kind of like my question.
Yeah, I think so. This is a little different than civil society, but something that I often think about, and it's a weird thing to wish because I have no control over it, but I just wish that either some movie or some music star or some sports star could come out of China and just kind of sweep the world. Yeah, in the way that Parasite kind of, was a total phenomenon for Korea and South Korea. It's not like everyone who saw Parasite then went out and started to like engage with Korean culture or something like that. But these are big, really big and really important markers, and they have a lot more, especially with younger generations, they have a lot more impact and influence than some of the political things. So, I don't know if anyone here is about to be that breakout artist who kind of bridges the two and changes the perception of China, but I do think that would be a really important development. And, from a civil society perspective, I think just kind of opening the doors and opening the windows to let a cultural phenomenon like that come through. Maybe it's not going to be one superstar or one movie that wins an Academy Award, but just the more windows and doors. I think the Three Body Problem, the Liu Cixin book, sci-fi book. It's a really, really big deal that Americans are reading Chinese science fiction and loving it. And I think it's in production with Netflix, and I'm like, that's kind of my last great hope for U.S.-China cultural ties, is that this Netflix series based on a Chinese book is really successful.
I heard it got into some trouble, like they were politicizing this. Somebody.
Yeah. Not a surprise, but I think that's increasingly, there's a lot of very specific kind of tactical things. I see a lot of my work as illustrating the ways that US and China are interconnected, so we can make smarter, targeted decisions about how we disentangle or don't in technology. That's a very kind of tactical thing, and I think everyone in their own areas can make some kind of a contribution that way, if you work in education or you work in the arts, wherever. But I must say, I do find myself putting a lot of hope on cultural, artistic bonds breaking through, because I think it has a lot of impact.
Here's another great question from my friend Warren Criven, who used to run HP's innovation lab in China, like global innovation, who manages HP's global innovation around, I think, 2010 or maybe before. It was a while ago when America is the technology dominant force. But the question is, the best science happens in a transparent, open collaboration, seeking the best of the best. Can we create institutions that can preserve this type of collaboration, that include the best minds, no matter what country they're in? Is it possible for science to collaborate with no border?
Yeah, I think, maybe first I'll give like the bad news, or the pessimistic version of this, which is that, put aside all of the sort of specific US-China tensions, the impact that emerging technologies have in the world, AI specifically, that's what I focus on. It has the potential impact and the potential uses have just changed. They're more powerful. They can be used for more nefarious purposes. And I think that's a big obstacle to kind of just going back to the old days. Like I wrote an analysis piece about one of the sort of biggest breakthroughs in AI in the last 5 or 10 years. And it came out of Microsoft Research's lab in Beijing. So it was all Chinese researchers working at an American lab in Beijing. And then you kind of saw like the benefits dispersed globally. It was a method for building neural networks for AI that lets you stack a lot more layers on the neural network called ResNet. And it was the kind of breakthrough that 5 years ago, this was really game-changing stuff. It's the most cited paper of the last 5 years of any academic paper. And at the time, no one gave a second thought to the fact that this should be immediately distributed globally, it should be published openly, and it doesn't matter who invented it. And I do think that just the nature of the technology has moved to a point where if that were to happen, if that kind of level of breakthrough were to happen again in the US or in China, I think there is a reasonable possibility and maybe a good reason why people would say maybe this is not something we should be publishing openly about. You see a lot of the most cutting edge research labs, particularly in the US and in Europe, starting to say AI as a technology is growing too powerful to just kind of default to the old method of everything is open, everything is published. So, and these are not people who are, China hawks or national security obsessed with that. They're scientists who just think the technology is maturing to a point where the number of kind of potential bad uses of it are so great and so powerful that we can't just be kind of broadcasting everything publicly. So I think that's kind of the pessimistic version, that even if you take out the US and China, the technology is growing powerful to a point that, you don't want someone openly publishing everything about making a nuclear bomb for the most part. And you might not want that in the future with certain emerging technologies. I think the optimistic version, which I think about a lot, is I try to think about areas where you can find a way to put together people from the US and China or beyond, US, China, India, Russia, Europe, wherever, to focus on applying the somewhat mature technologies that we have to tackling specific problems that are sort of widely recognized as problems. So to me, where I put a lot of my thought is into climate change issues. There's a big push in AI to apply AI to climate problems. And I think if you're doing that, you're talking about a narrow enough thing. You're not talking about fundamental breakthroughs that change the game and might need to be protected. You're talking about very specific things. How do you use drones to identify wildfires before they spread too big and put them out? Or you're talking about how, using AI to improve models of climate. I think there is a lot of possibility. It's something I'm kind of always working on a bit in the back of my head of, can we create these venues where Americans, Chinese, people from other countries are working together and applying technology together in a setting where we all agree the outcome is positive. And I hope that other than just creating good solutions, this is a trust building exercise. This is a matter of building connections between the two, like human connections between the two sides that stay open. And so that's something that I kind of hope to be a part of, is building something like that.
Yeah, I can agree more as someone work in the kind of shared impact space. And it also goes to one of the questions from the audience member about so we're for technology, for countries to work together on the cutting edge technology for the shared benefit of the earth and humanity, so that we don't get into a Black Mirror kind of future, or like AI can be used for really, really bad thing. We need countries to work together to make sure we have some minimum standards or consensus there. So I know some people are talking about AI diplomacy. We already have climate change diplomacy, which as my husband is in the space, and I personally still think in the Biden era, it's going to be a promising field as well, to answer your question, Sizi. And also I work a little bit with the food and the kind of new food space, sustainable ag space, advising some startups working in both countries. I think that those are all like for our shared future. And these spaces, we have to work together. There's no other choices. And I hope people who work in the helping the two countries working together in this space are not going to be in trouble because of that, like tech. So I think we are on the hour mark, but we're still having great questions coming in. Matt, do you have another 10 minutes? Can we go?
Yeah. No, I'm happy to keep talking.
Yeah,
Good
those
question.
are really, really great questions. And Warren has a follow-up comment. So thanks for the answer. Very interesting. Historically, back in the last century, when there was Russian science, Chinese science, and Western science, that was the solution. It is to keep the focus in the human-centered solution where trust can be built. Yes, great discussion. Okay, thank you, Warren, for the comment. And I think I still see a earlier question that we were. So do Chinese people educated in the US, the question is, do Chinese people educated in the US feel comfortable doing business in today's political environment in China? I think this is from Lena, right? Lena has been left China maybe quite a while ago. Should they separate their business ambition from politics? I think a lot of us, could struggle with this. Values and political system really are dominating a lot of the social life there, in business.
Yeah, I mean, really, this is a question that I should turn around and ask you and ask all of our audience, because this is an individual choice. Do you feel that you can operate in China in a way that you feel like is doing good, that doesn't compromise on some ethical foundation that you don't want to, where you can have a real impact? And I think this is one area where, just what you see as your home or who you see as the people who are kind of closest to you really matters. I think for Americans, it's very easy to say, if they're presented with like an ethical dilemma, they want to do something in China, they think it will, have a good impact on, say, like child nutrition or child poverty or something like that. But to do that, you have to get involved with some local governments. And if you look at what the local governments do in some other area, it's very, it's very bad from an ethical perspective. You don't agree with it. I think for Americans who don't feel a true kind of connection to people and culture and society in China, it's very easy to say, nope, I just don't want to be a part of that. If it's ethically dirty, I don't want to be a part of it, and I'm out. But the fact is, people want to make an impact where they come from, oftentimes. And if you feel truly bound into Chinese society in some way, you're willing to deal with some messiness in a way that maybe an American or someone who's an outsider is not willing to deal with. You say, yes, it is dealing with this government body or this company that I don't think is, a perfect paragon of ethics and good things, but I think the good outweighs the bad, and I'm willing to do it. And I think that's, it's an acceptance of the way the Chinese system works, that recognizing this is the way it works, I can't change it. If I want to have an impact, in the place where I want to impact the most, I have to be engaged in this. And, the fact is, if you're an American, you just don't think of things that way. America is the place where you maybe want to have the most impact. It's home, If you're in China, it's your home. You accept all of its faults and its messiness, and you say, I have to engage. I have to engage here. And so that's, maybe a Chinese person, an American, and of course, Chinese Americans or immigrants are kind of right on the cusp of that. I know myself as someone who spent 5 years in China, who thinks of a lot of people in China as, friends that are like family, that are very close to me. I think I also have a different tolerance with engaging for Chinese society than someone who doesn't feel bound to Chinese people in the same way. So yeah, we're kind of all on this, this spectrum somewhere. And usually when I talk to Americans, I try to encourage them to understand why people are willing to, engage in institutions to try to bring about the greater good, even if it involves a lot of messiness. And when I talk to Chinese people who aren't worried at all about that ethical messiness, I'm like, hey, maybe you should think a little bit more about those ethical questions. So there's no clear-cut answer. I just feel it's a lot about a sense of belonging, a sense of home, and where you want to make your impact.
It's pretty complicated. I think we still have a couple questions. We're closing soon. I think maybe one question this person asked. Can you talk a little bit about Made in China 2025? Do you think the program will succeed?
That's a very specific technical question. I forget all these emotions talking about impact on home. Made in China 2025, for people who don't know, this is a very high profile government plan. It was released in 2015, trying to upgrade the Chinese manufacturing system. The idea, like, you don't want to be a producer of cheap, low-cost goods. You want to identify sort of strategic sectors, new energy vehicles, semiconductors, aerospace. And China basically said, these are the industries of the future. We want to build up our own companies in that space. And so, we're going to make big investments in that. Sorry, my throat's dry. This Made in China 2025 played very crucially into a lot of the backlash that we talked about earlier, where when the trade war started, Made in China 2025 was kind of the plan that was identified as the reason we have to wage a trade war. China is trying to dominate these future industries. We can't let them do that. And so we need to target a lot of restrictions on that. So that's just kind of the history and the importance of Made in China 2025. I think, broadly speaking, the plan is going to be relatively successful. I think China has already made a ton of ground in upgrading its industrial base. And this is something that I'm really interested in, and I've written about recently, that China sees, for a long time, we predicted, economists predicted that, as China grows richer and as wages increase, all that manufacturing is going to go away. It's going to go to Southeast Asia. It's going to go to India, to cheaper places. And so there was this bet that was going to kind of slow down Chinese economic development on a 15-year time scale. And I think what China is fundamentally doing is it's betting on applying emerging technology to their existing factories, their industrial base, as a way to sort of lever them up to the next level and make it so, the labor is more expensive here, but it's worth it because these are the most advanced factories in the world that produce, with a level of precision and a level of quality that can't be matched elsewhere. And this is something that the US, I think, should be paying attention to. I think the US should be trying to apply emerging technology to upgrade our manufacturing ecosystem, but it's not something where the US government doesn't have a lot of great levers to slow China down on this. You can try to cut off chips, but that's tough. Yeah. You can only do it in a targeted way. A lot of this stuff is not ethically wrong things. It's just trying to make factories more efficient and reduce waste. Yeah. So I'd say, I think the Chinese government is in a pretty good position on this front. And a lot of it comes down to, we've gone from a phase in the US of trying to, slow down China, stop China, cut off China. I think a lot of that energy going forward needs to be redirected into increasing capabilities in the US. Yes. That frankly, if China wants to do something entirely domestically and it has the skills and it has the investment money and it has the chips in some cases, you're not going to have a lot of impact on that. And if you don't want to just kind of be washed away, if you don't want China to just continue to be the factory of the world for another 15, 20, 25 years, we gotta up our game here in the US. So I guess that's kind of my assessment.
I think the key difference there is that China is able to make these long-term, very effective industrial policies, and where US, with the shorter horizon of administrations, it's just harder to. They talk about bringing manufacturing back to the US, and they realize that actually a lot of R&D are incorporated in the manufacturing themselves, right? You can't just outsource manufacturing to keep the sweet part. It's not possible. And what happens is China's upgrading with these new capabilities capabilities, tech-enabled. So I think this is just a different political regime. There's pros and cons, and but I personally also hope that U.S. is looking more inward and trying to build its own kind of R&D edge, right, and industrial capacity through smarter policies. So I think we're wrapping up here because with we're coming to a 10 minute after, and really appreciate that you spend the time with us, and it's great. We covered a lot of questions, and really urge everyone to buy his Matt's book on Amazon. We have links here, and I also on behalf of the Yuyuanshe, Michelle of Yuyuanshe, I want to thank Matt for joining us for this dialogue. And also we want to really next time after post-COVID, looking forward to having a real hot pot or cocktail party at their historic mansion in San Jose when you're in the area. And I'm also, I wanted to announce the next fireside chat on behalf of Yuyuanshe. We'll have a conversation with a Chinese immigrant documentary filmmaker, Wu Hao. You probably also heard about him.
Yeah, I met him last year.
76 days, the movie about COVID pandemic in Wuhan on the front line. It's really awesome movie. It's online, streaming online, and critically acclaimed by many mainstream media. You could take a look at the movie, and many think that this will be a movie that maybe win an Oscar or some major awards. And Wu Hao has a lot of interesting other documentaries. People's Republic of Desire about YY Zhubo, live streaming platform, very much about the Chinese live stream platform and the hosts their life. Interesting movie. So thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you next time. And really, Matt, do you have a last word to the?
No, I just wanted to say thank you to you, Eva, for the really thoughtful questions. Thank you to Michelle and Pat, and to Yuyuanshe. I'm very excited about this group and this organization. I hope to meet everyone. And also, I just put in the chat there on the right, I put my email down in there in case anyone wants to get in touch. I always learn so much from talking to and interacting with people who also care about this stuff, who work on some related issue. So feel free to get in touch. And yeah, thanks to everyone for coming.
Great, thank you. Ganbei, everyone.
Ganbei.
Already did.
All
right. Bye. Have a nice weekend.